You are listening to the Hiking Radio Network, where we talk the walk with shows by hikers, about hikers, for everybody.
Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Join Steve and his guests every week as he staggers from Georgia to Maine.
Hi guys, and it's lovely to have you along again, listening to Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. I'm your host, Steve Adams, or Mighty Blue, bringing hopefully some great stories to you from the trail and, again, hopefully, brightening up your day a little as we all try to get through this flipping coronavirus crisis. I am successfully driving myself crazy staying indoors the whole time. Yet I count myself as one of the lucky ones, as I'm retired and not personally affected by the terrible unemployment that I fear we're just starting to see the beginning of. Today's main guest is Bobby O'Donnell, or Handyman. Bobby wrote to me with a stellar story, and I think that the interview does justice to his story. Hope you agree when we hear from Bobby in a minute. Kate Stillwell, our woman of a certain age, is back, making a decision about whether or not to go for a hike this year. We'll find out what she decided to do after Bobby. Thanks to all of you who wrote to me answering the 3 questions that I gave last week in our book giveaway. I'll be recapping those questions a little later for those of you who still want to enter. And also today, Grandma Gatewood appears in Sports Illustrated, though not in a bikini. Her story 65 years ago was really starting to infiltrate the country's consciousness. She also finds out that not learning to swim when she was younger was probably a big mistake. So let's first of all hear from our main guest today, Bobby O'Donnell, or Handyman. Okay, I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. He's another listener who wrote in with a fascinating story. This is Bobby O'Donnell. Hi, Bobby. How are you?
Hey, Steve. It's great to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for writing in. Oh, by the way, I meant to ask you, what is your trail name?
My trail name is Handyman.
Handyman. Well, go on then. Why? Why are you Handyman?
It was in the first few days on the AT. It was actually at Neal's Gap, so right at the start, where you finally get the first little resupply. And
Sure.
I'd gotten a nice frozen pizza and some ice cream, so I wasn't hungry for my dinner that night. And so I was just snacking in my tent, and I fell asleep with some snacks in my tent. And I woke up at 2 a.m. with a mouse on my face that had chewed right through my tent. And the next day, I was having to patch my tent up. And a few days after that, I'd fixed someone else's tent, put out a campfire and things like that. So I became Handyman.
Handyman indeed, quite right.
Yeah.
Now, you're a paramedic, and you told me that you're currently working in New Hampshire during this COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, that's correct.
That isn't the reason I got you on the show, but since you're here, how's that working out from your perspective? What are you seeing these days? By the way, we're now recording on the April the 30th, I believe it is.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, it's an interesting time. I've been a paramedic for 6 years now, and it's honestly, it comes in waves. It's been some of the slowest I've seen in the 911 emergency side because people just aren't going to the hospital. There are, emergencies that people would sometimes call for that aren't necessarily that urgent, but they'd still be calling for an ambulance. People aren't doing that anymore because they're more frightened of what might happen once they get to the hospital, the risk of getting infected with COVID. Conversely, we're seeing people wait longer periods of time to call. So, I worry about my grandparents who have heart conditions who are so terrified to go out into the public or to go to the hospital that people who are having chest pain are waiting and waiting and waiting until it's absolutely unbearable. So these pathologies are much worse presentations than what we normally see.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. So when this all shakes out, which it assuredly will at one stage, will we find the numbers different to what we think they are now, do you think?
I think so. I think the data is going to be really hard to get an accurate depiction of just because of, numbers of testing and what we are testing for when we go to the emergency room, because a lot of times where testing isn't readily available, if someone is complaining of, the signs and symptoms of COVID, they might not necessarily get the testing that they need.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll just have to see how that shakes out. Now, you hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2018, did a thru-hike, and you came to hiking the AT out of the world of marathon running, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
When and where was your first marathon?
My first marathon was in November 2011 in Philadelphia.
And I think you mentioned to me before that for your very first marathon, you broke 4 hours, didn't you?
I did just under 357.
What's the best one you've done so far?
309. So
Wow,
still
cool.
trying to get that 3 hour mark.
Wow, that's proper running, isn't it? So, apparently, anything less than 4 hours, everybody tells me is proper running. Now, I promise you, and I promise everybody here, there's a reason I'm doing this way, but we're not going to run through the list of all your marathons. But tell me what happened in your second marathon.
Yeah, my second marathon was unfortunately the Boston Marathon in 2013. I grew up just outside of Boston, so being in New England, it's always a huge deal. It's Patriots Day in Massachusetts when the Boston Marathon is, and that's really why I started running. I wanted to run the Boston Marathon, and the
Right.
first year I had the opportunity to do it was in 2013, which was infamously the year of the marathon bombing.
So where were you when the bomb went off?
I was a half mile from the finish line. I was at the Mass Ave Bridge. So the Boston Marathon's quite famous for having two sharp turns at the finish. You take a right on Hereford and a left on Boylston. So by the race course, I was a half mile, but in geographic distance, it was much closer. So you could hear the bombs, but you couldn't see them.
So what was interesting, we've seen obviously people's reactions around the finish itself and when the bomb went off, and it's etched on a lot of people's minds, a lot of those images, I'm sure.
Mm.
But you were witness to an event in history which was just around the corner, as it were. You were just off screen. What was the reaction of people around you?
There was a lot of confusion because no one was quite sure what had happened. Even the police officers that had stopped the race where I was, they weren't sure what was going on because of the amount of chaos and confusion that was occurring at the finish line area. So for a while, we were just told to stop. And it's quite a strange feeling after you've been running for so long and it's the Boston Marathon and obviously a high profile event. And all of a sudden you stop that close to the finish line. And then finally, when the police officers said that the race was over, it created, even more confusion amongst the runners and everyone around.
Wow.
And finally, the first kind of inkling that you got that something was seriously wrong was that people were running away from the finish line back towards you. And it was like
Wow.
almost like something out of a movie scene.
I'm sure it was, and I'm just trying to picture that myself now. As I say, we've seen those pictures on the TV, but we haven't seen what happened to you guys. And when did you realize what had happened then?
I stopped one of the spectators and I asked her if she could tell me what was happening. And she just looked up at me, and I'll never forget the look that she had on her face. And she told me that bombs had exploded at the finish line. And I was 19 when this happened. And it's just, at any age, how do you process something like that? But what it really was for me was that my entire family was at the finish line
Oh
waiting
my
for me.
gosh! So they weren't affected, I presume, were they?
No, very, very lucky that they were
Wow.
actually on the opposite side of the street from the
Jeez.
bombs.
So what effect did the bomb have upon you? Because of course, the effects aren't always immediate, are they? How did it affect you?
At first, it didn't affect me all that much, except that I was, 19 years old in my first Boston Marathon. I was, obviously upset at what had happened. I was upset that
Sure.
I couldn't finish. But obviously, I'm very lucky that my family was all okay. But I didn't know that for a very long period of
No,
time. I
no.
I didn't run with a cell phone, and I finally got a hold of a phone from all of these news reporters, and news vans were starting to get as close to the finish line as they could to report on the story. So I borrowed a phone from one of these reporters, and I called my mom, and it didn't even ring. It just got this pre-recorded message saying that the
Oh
caller you're
God.
trying to reach is unavailable. So I called my dad, and it was the same thing. My grandmother was the same thing. My aunt the same thing. And to me, it wasn't that they're trying to make sure that cell phones aren't detonating secondary devices. Why would anyone really ever think like that in the civilian world?
Yeah.
It was that their phones had blown up and my whole family was dead.
Oh my gosh, that's awful. So that was immediate. You found out they're okay, but things started setting in for you, didn't they?
Yeah, I think, obviously my family who was at the finish line, incredibly traumatic to visually see all of that had happened.
Of course.
And my immediate feelings in the days and weeks and months following the marathon was guilt, that I was responsible for them being there. If I wasn't running the Boston Marathon, then they wouldn't have been in the city that day, and it was my fault. So
Mm.
I really wanted to make sure, especially my mom, that they were doing okay. So I put all of all of my responsibility into doing that and not really checking up on myself. But those first few hours after the marathon bombing, when I thought that my family had died, I can't even describe that feeling of emptiness that really continued to stay with me for a long time.
Yeah, and how are you now? Because I know you went through some PTSD, depression, anxiety, but how are you actually now? Because this is now how long? 7 years later?
Yeah, it's 7 years this month, later. So, I'm good. And the thing that I talk about when I give speeches and things like this now is that when we look at mental health, you can't look at it as a linear track.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. That was interesting. So you said to me that mental health is not a linear path. What does that mean in your life? How does that manifest itself then for you?
I think when I finally, decided to seek counseling for what I was going through, that in itself is a big step because mental health in general, you can't get an X-ray or a CAT scan that gives you this diagnosis, and you're the first person who can realize that something's wrong. It's in your head.
Sure.
And when you finally say it to someone else, or you say it out loud, or you put a diagnosis to it, it makes it a very real thing. And that in itself is quite difficult. And then, especially when you go out and seek counseling and you're confiding in someone else, it's these big steps that take a lot to get out and do. And when that doesn't work, sometimes that's even more stressful and more depressing because you finally made this large stride forward and it almost feels like you're taking a few steps back. But then once it starts to work and you start to get this positive feedback that you're feeling better and things are working out, you can get down again and you can get depressed. And what you have to realize is that doesn't devalue or take away from the progress you've already made. And what I come to look at it now is, it's 7 years later and I have good days and I have bad days, but I'm always moving in the right direction.
Is that I'm not a doctor. Actually, you're a paramedic, so you're much more qualified than me. But is it a bit like being an alcoholic? You may be able to kick it, but you're always an alcoholic.
I think so. I don't think that PTSD for me will ever go away.
Right.
But I'm okay with that because every year it gets a little bit better.
Sure. And you wrote a book about it, didn't you? Tell us about that. Was it therapeutic for you to do that?
Yeah, it was a different experience from the events of the book itself. The book is called Running Wild because what ultimately helped me get through my PTSD and what I was struggling with from the Boston Marathon was I hated running after the marathon bombing because it was just a reminder of that day, and it was frustrating because something that had been a stress relief and such a large part of my life now was just inducing stress, and I needed to figure out how to get running back.
Sure.
And I ended up just started traveling, and I ended up traveling all over the world, and I ran a marathon on all 7 continents. And what it was more about, when I look back on it, out of all the races, 7 races, it was about 44 hours of running over a year of travel.
Wow.
And it was mostly the people and the conversations that I had because when the marathon bombing happened, I was 19 years old. I had never left the United States before. And I grew up in suburban Massachusetts. And I would argue that I never really faced adversity until the marathon bombing. And now all of a sudden, the world is this large, scary place that I didn't want to be a part of. And then with all of this traveling that occurred because of the running, I was able to see all the good that there was in the world.
So I'm going to come back to the fact you've done it on seven continents in a minute, because that means Antarctica.
Yep.
Where? Where'd you run in Antarctica?
I ran on King George Island, which is just off the coast of Antarctica, and that was in January of 2016. And it was a really amazing experience to be able to run with penguins,
I would think
running around you.
that
Yeah,
is awesome. You got to send us a picture of that, I'll tell you.
yeah.
So what is it in a marathon that gives you healing? Is it the fact that you are running with this bunch of other people? Do you feel do you interact with people when you're running, or is it just the battle of getting through 15 miles, 10 miles, 20 miles, or that sort of thing? I mean, how does it work out for you?
I find that I'm really able to sort through my thoughts when I'm running, and I think after the marathon bombing, the road running for me and being in New England, it was detrimental because those thoughts for me were just about how horrible that day was. But it was when I started running in these really remote places and running on trails and running up mountains that I was able to focus on kind of the beauty that was around me and work through my thoughts and emotions in a more therapeutic manner instead of something just so oppressive in my brain.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. So So at this stage, when you're doing these marathons, you did your travel and so on, you felt yourself getting better. Was the AT on your radar at all? Had you ever hiked at all?
Yeah, I had hiked, growing up in Massachusetts. My family had a home in New Hampshire, and I went to college in New Hampshire. I'd spent quite a lot of time in the Whites and hiking around the Whites, and I've been really fortunate to go to a lot of beautiful places, but the Whites are undoubtedly one of my favorite places in the world.
Yeah,
The AT had been slightly on my radar just because I'd spent sections on it. Just you'd
right,
go through up a trail in the Whites, and then all of a sudden you'd pop onto the AT.
right,
And
right.
just growing up, you hear about the Appalachian Trail, and you hear some of the stories. And it had always been something that I'd kind of thought about, but wasn't too sure I was ready to commit 4 or 5 months of my life to it.
But then something happened to one of your, I think your marathon running friends, in 2016 that eventually led you to the trail. What happened?
Yeah, it's actually one of my hiking friends. So I was working at an emergency room in Plymouth, New Hampshire, which is kind of just at the base of the Whites. And we had a really nice work hiking community, and so spent a lot of time with the same people. And one of my really good friends, Rachel, who had spent quite a bit of time hiking with, she was someone who was always really encouraging of the Appalachian Trail, and she was about 8 years older than me. And she's saying, it's going to get to a point in your life where maybe you might not be able to consider it as seriously, and you might not be as willing to take the time to do it as you are now. You
Sure.
should really make the jump and go do it. And she was always kind of pushing me a little bit more every time we'd go out hiking to go do the AT. And then, really sadly, in December of 2016, Rachel took her own life.
Wow. Did you ever know why?
No, I think that you can't ever really speculate into someone's mind
Okay.
who's
Okay, you're
done
right.
something like
You're
that.
absolutely right. Yeah. No, I've just it suddenly struck me that wonder if it was related to some of the traumas you were having as well, but obviously not. So, so you decided to go? Was that the thing that spurred you on to want to then do the AT because she'd then passed?
Absolutely. Yeah, that single thing led me from maybe kind of thinking about doing it to absolutely doing it.
Did that traumatize you in a degree? Because a lot of people seem to come to the trail with some sort of trauma that's happened to them and they want to address something. Was yours a general feeling that running and hiking made you feel better, or was it specifically because Rachel, who had wanted to do it, had passed and you wanted to do it almost for her as well?
I think it was twofold. I definitely did the trail in honor of Rachel because she had been so encouraging, and it was something that she probably would have done if she had the time or when she would have been able to do it. But a lot of it too was, Rachel held so many memories for me in the Whites, and it was almost, I can relate it in a way to the marathon bombing where I didn't enjoy running immediately after that because I would reflect back to the day of the marathon bombing. And after Rachel died, so that summer of 2017, I would go up into the Whites and I would hike. And instead of really enjoying the Whites, without any inhibitions, it was every time I was on a certain trail, I'd remember a day out with Rachel on that
Oh, how
trail. And,
awesome.
and I think you can relate to that. I look back at the AT, and on certain bits of trail or in certain areas, I can remember exactly what I was thinking or exactly who I was
Oh,
talking
yeah,
to,
definitely,
in
definitely.
Lehigh Gap or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's how it was for the Whites for me, and it really bothered me.
So I'm going to come back to that in a minute because you said something about the Whites and South Twin Mountain. I want to cover that near the end.
Mhm.
Um, so what was your timeline after that? Then you decided to go. She passed in December 16, and you went
Mhm.
in April 18, I believe. What was your timeline, and how were you planning towards it?
Yeah, so that 2017, I was still in the middle of running around the continent, so I wanted to finish that up. And in a way, I had realized how much the running around the world had helped me get through the marathon bombing. I thought maybe I think I had 3 continents left when Rachel died. So I
Right.
thought, maybe finishing up these travels and getting back out into the world might help me work through it. And the next, obviously, hiking season I would be able to hike the AT was 2018, but the plans were laid really in December 2016.
Yeah. So how did you prepare for the trail then?
I spent a lot of time just still running because I had to. I was in the middle of doing this, but I instead of doing my normal training cycles of running on some of the trails in central New Hampshire, I was working, I spent a lot of time kind of forcing myself into the whites, even though sometimes it was uncomfortable,
Sure,
you
sure.
know, with these memories of Rachel. I thought that if I could spend as much time in the whites as I could and running around those mountains, and I actually used finishing. There's, I don't know if you're familiar, there's 48 4,000 foot
Yes,
mountains in
yes,
New
I
Hampshire.
am.
So
I
I,
am. I've zero desire to do them, but yeah, great. Knock
yeah,
yourself out.
yeah. So I finished my 48. Actually, I did most of them that summer of 2017, and then I finished the 48 on the anniversary of Rachel's death on the mountain
Oh,
that
wow.
she finished on
Oh
in
my
December
gosh.
2017.
Wow. So you headed out in, I think it was April 2018. Do you find there are similarities between hiking and marathon running for you, both physically and psychologically?
Yeah, I think, I think that more psychologically than physically. And I tried to go into the Appalachian Trail not having an ego about, having run lots of marathons and being very fit. And I think that held to my advantage, making sure that I stayed very humble with my ability for distances. The first week to 2 weeks of the trail, I was going maybe 10, 11, 12 miles a day, not going further than that, not wanting to push myself because I was so afraid of getting injured. And I think that this is something that all hikers can relate to. You have this big dream to hike the AT, you quit your job, you give up your lease, you prepare, you tell everyone you're going. And then for me, the worst case scenario was I get hurt in the first 2 weeks, and then
Yes.
all of
Oh,
a
yeah.
sudden it's over. So I was really paranoid about that. So as much as I was physically prepared, I was still very, very conservative with my miles and what I was doing. I think that psychologically, though,
Hang on, hang on. Eating
yeah.
pizza in your tent doesn't count as being prepared. That's not a good idea, by the way, but you carry on.
I think psychologically there's a pretty good advantage. Mostly, I think I found this running ultra marathons when you're getting into these really long events. And over my running career, when you're running for 16, 17, 18 hours, and you're just pushing your body, and you need to just play games with yourself and do things in your head to keep yourself motivated. And I found
Sure.
that especially on harder days in the AT, just the longer days, if you're trying to push into a town, or mostly it was 2018 was a pretty wet year. So when I was very wet and cold, just able to keep my mind going, I think is what gets people through it.
2018 was an incredibly cold year to start. You started in April, so a lot of that cold had finished by then, hadn't it? So that was
I was okay. I know people who started in early March, mid March, especially in the Smokies, had so much snow.
that's right.
We had one. I had one day of snow in Georgia, and that was it. So I was pretty lucky, but it was pretty cold.
And the gear you took with you, did you have to refine that gear because you were more of a day hiker before, weren't you? As I understood it, did you have
Yeah,
to change your gear much?
I did. I ended up changing my sleeping bag and my down jacket. I think I had a bit of I was a bit too cocky coming from New Hampshire and being from the north that the south wasn't going to be that cold, despite everything that I had read. And
Yeah, right.
it very much was cold. I remember in Franklin, North Carolina, I did with some of my trail family at the time, did a big REI order, and ordered a new sleeping bag and a new down jacket to prepare for the cold in the Smokies. So I was very humbled by the self.
And in your original email to me, you wrote that the AT was arguably better than any of the other travel I'd done previously. In what way did you find that then? What was it about the AT? And this is, and a lot of people find this, by the way, but there is something magical about the AT that just strikes you, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what it was for the AT with me, and I still absolutely stand by that. That hiking the AT, I'm more proud of hiking the AT than I am of running marathons on every continent. And I think it was such a moving journey and adventure because it was this, you had the same goal every day of moving north. It was that, it wasn't with, traveling around, your plans are changing and things are moving so quickly. But with the AT, it was every day. My only objectives were to feed myself, drink, stay safe, and move north. And it was this very simplistic form of living. And I think so many people and other thru hikers that I talk with can resonate with this, that once you get back into your normal life, all you want to do is get back to that simplicity of life on the trail. And I still crave that.
Yeah, I keep referring to it as life gives you too many darn options. The AT
Mm.
gives you no options. So if you fall over, you've got to get up. There is just literally no other option. If you just sat there, you're going to die. So you might as well get up. And I love that, having very few options in the real life we have now. Even though we're all shut in at the moment, I've still got tons of options of things I could do. And did you team up with other hikers when you were on there, or did you make this something of a solo pursuit?
I think in my head, before I started the trail and the more research I'd done, I realized how social the AT was. And originally, I wanted it to be more of an independent thing, and I was going to keep to myself. But it's so hard to do that once you're on the AT, and that in itself was, I felt, very healing in a way that you just feel so comfortable around other hikers, and you develop relationships with people so much more quickly,
Yes.
and that in itself was very therapeutic.
Yeah, because you're all in the same boat. You meet somebody at shelter, oh, I say mile 836 or whatever, you both know what you've done to get there. So I love that part.
I think the AT really is the ultimate leveling ground of people. And I remember very early on in the trail, I had this quite cathartic experience where someone had lit a fire, and these two guys were having a conversation, and one of them looked like he was in his early 20s, and the other one was in his late 40s, early 50s, and it was kind of listening in the conversation. It was a conversation that people have very frequently on the AT, which is about gear and weight of gear and
Yes.
pack shakedowns and things like that. And I was kind of just listening in on the conversation, and then they got into how they ended up on the trail. And the older gentleman was an ICU physician from New York, and the 20-something-year-old kid had quit his job at a convenience store to go out on the AT, and they were having this, amazing conversation. And I thought to myself, in what other situation in the world would these two people be having that conversation? And what it comes down to on the AT is, like you just said, both people had to do the exact same thing to end up where they were at the end
Yeah.
of that day. Whether they had both had the same weather, they both had to go over the same hills. It really is just the ultimate leveling ground to people.
Yeah, and that's wonderful because you run into different people all the time, and I think anybody who kind of doubts that, just go out there for a few hours. You'll find
Absolutely.
there are tons of different people. And did you find that the AT continued to give you the sort of treatment that your running had been giving you? Did it extend that? Did it continue to heal you?
I think it did, yeah, and a lot of it too can be attributed to, I think, trail angels. Like when I went out to run around the world, I was constantly surprised by how generous and how kind people were, because we live in a world where the media is constantly pushing negative news because they're catchy stories, and it seems like you're always bombarded by negativity if you're watching TV or reading the news on your phone. And all of a
Or
sudden,
looking at Facebook.
or looking at Facebook, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was one thing I did. I deleted my social media for the AT, and
Oh, did
I
you?
found that I really enjoyed that
Oh, interesting.
quite a bit. I did a blog, but I had a friend who had my Facebook password, and he would post it for me,
All right.
which was pretty good. But when you see trail angels, and was just constantly blown away by what people would do for you without ever having known you or met you, the absolute kindness of people. And it really does, it's the cliche thing I think that people say about the AT, but it really, really does restore your faith in humanity.
Oh, no, absolutely no question at all. And in August, you got to the Whites. You got back to the Whites, which is where you'd hiked before,
Mhm.
and something happened there that put a lot of things into focus, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I had been thoroughly enjoying the AT. I had been on trail for about 4 months now and had some of the most amazing experiences and met so many incredible people. But I was still a little frustrated because I didn't feel like I had the closure that I had been hoping for with the death of Rachel. And it seemed like every day, especially as I was nearing the end of the trail, I was still searching for it, and I was waiting for something to happen.
Sure.
And I can really, when I look back at the whole trail, there was one specific day that felt like it all came together for me. And that was when I was coming over Franconia Ridge, and especially spending so much time in the Whites before. I had never stayed in one of the huts, and
Right.
I'd always gone in to get water and things like that. But they're really expensive
Really? I
I'm like,
know
oh
they
my
are.
god.
Yeah.
So I'd never actually stayed at one of the huts, and I thought, oh, being a thru hiker, maybe now I'll be able to do work for stay, which I still didn't get to do. But I'd come over Franconia Ridge. I'd gone over Mount Garfield, which is actually where we spread Rachel's ashes. Was her favorite mountain in the
Right.
Whites.
Right.
So pretty emotional experience of the day already, and I was quite ready to be done for the day as I got down to Galehead Hut. and I'd gone in and asked to see if I could do a work for stay there, and it was pretty late in the day, and they had already had their thru hikers for the day.
Right.
And I thought to myself, oh, I still have this. The only way forward going north is this really steep climb up South Twin. And I said, oh,
That's
you know
right.
what? I was like, it's one of my least favorite climbs in the Whites. The climb up the Wildcats is pretty tough too, though.
Yes.
So I pushed up that climb, and it was just about sunset. And I had remembered just from being up there quite a few times before that there's a little nook between some of the rocks on the top of that mountain. And I hiked the AT with a Big Agnes Fly Creek UL1 tent, so pretty tiny, compact tent. I
Sure.
said, oh, I bet I can get my tent in between those rocks. So I got up top, and there's no one else up there. I set my tent up between the rocks, and I just kind of sat up there. And I had this beautiful view, and I looked back at Franconia Ridge, and the sky was
Wow.
purple, and I could see Mount Garfield. And I started to just have a conversation with Rachel. And for the first time since it had happened, I allowed myself to get angry with her for how she had made me feel, and her friends, and her husband, and her parents. And I kind of just vocalized this, and I yelled at her, and then I forgave her for what she did. And then had this really, and then I just talked to her about my journey on the trail and all of these things. And I finally felt that I had some bit of closure to this. And, I attribute it all to really this one night, but
Wow.
it took the whole journey of the AT to South Twin to get me there. I think that if I had just gone up South Twin and had this conversation, then it might not have been as profound as it was if I had hiked 1,800 miles to get there.
Sure.
And even more special because South Twin was actually the last mountain that Rachel and I had hiked together.
Wow. Well, I mean, you were probably kind of dreading being in the Whites on the way up there, weren't you? Because you'd always hiked with her, and when you were preparing for this, you had a problem with the Whites, and then so you knew you were going to have to go through the Whites on your through hike. So I'd imagine it was a relief for you to be able to go through them and have such a great experience there, because that is a magnificent view. I know exactly where you mean as well. That is an amazing view there.
Yeah,
Franconia Ridge is awesome, and absolutely loved it there.
really incredible.
So, were you glad or were you sad once the hike was over?
I think for the first few days after the hike was over, I was pretty glad. My feet were hurting pretty bad.
Of course.
Southern Maine was much more challenging than I thought it was going to be. I think I knew exactly what to expect going into the Whites, which I think was a pretty big advantage, but I had no idea what even that last 14 miles of New Hampshire, once you cross the road, you come down off of the Carters, Rachel and Mariah.
Yes.
You
Yes.
cross the road, and then it's just like a 14-mile stretch into Maine from there. You're near Gorham, New Hampshire.
That's right.
Like that was no 4,000 footers, but a really tough stretch of trail there. And then right into Southern Maine, really, I think beat me up pretty good.
Yeah. Southern Maine is always a shock.
Yeah. But it kind of went through this wave right at the end, the last 2.5, 3 weeks where I'd been, I think like everyone does, I'd been pushing some pretty good mileage. And then I had this day where I realized that it was going to be over. And I think when you conceptualize a through hike, at least for me, I never really thought about it being something I had done in the past. It was always thinking about getting forward, getting to Katahdin, but
Sure.
not being so excited to think that I'd stand atop the mountain. And I started to slow down because I didn't want it to be over. And I didn't really have a timeline of when I needed to finish by, which was really nice.
A lot of
And
people, you know what? A lot of people do that. It's kind of surprising, but a lot of people seem to do that.
it's a strange feeling. And I think it just it really does come in waves because on the AT, all you do is have time to think. And you'll be thinking about one thing and be like, oh my God, it's going to be over. I need to slow down and really make sure I'm enjoying it. And
Sure.
then as you get even closer to Katahdin, you realize how close you actually are. And then you just want to be there. So it's quite a conflicting feeling,
Yes.
I think.
But when you touch the sign, that's a pretty marvelous moment, isn't it? There's nothing like it, is there?
It's absolutely incredible. It's just something, I had not hiked Katahdin before I did it on the AT. And it's amazing because you obviously know what the sign looks like. And in your head, at least before I'd go to bed every night in my tent, I would think about that sign at
Yeah.
some point during the
Yeah.
night. And then to actually see it and know that it's real and touch it is the best feeling I've ever had.
Sure. Now you know that as a guy with self-confessed mental health issues, and you've had this because of what happened to you, and you know that after Katahdin, people often say, or after finishing the AT, people talk about post-trail depression and so on. Did your mental health take a dip after the hike, or did you move on to something else quickly?
I was really lucky. I had a pretty interesting experience where I finished the hike, and like I said, I had kind of 2-3 days where I took a rest, and then was excited to get back into the whites because we had a really mild September. It was really nice weather, so I think I finished August 31st, and then September 3rd I did a presidential traverse with a friend, and then
Oh, awesome.
did a few things after that. But I had a really cool experience on the AT where a few of my friends that I had met in Nepal. So the last continent that I had for my marathons was Asia, and
Right.
I did the Everest Marathon in Nepal, and you had to spend quite a bit of time with people during that because you had to acclimatize to the altitude. And
How high is that?
you start just below base camp, so it's about 17,000
Oh
feet.
my God.
Yeah. So I became incredibly close with a few of these people, and two of them, Tom Power, who's a detective in Ireland, and Fiona Smith, who's a reindeer herder in the Scottish Highlands, they became some of my best friends. So they actually flew out in July to hike with me for a week when I was in
Nice.
Vermont, which was really cool to see them. And Fiona and I had kind of joked a bit about me not really having a plan immediately to go back to work after the trail. And she said, why don't you just come to Scotland when you're done and herd reindeer for a little bit?
As you do.
Yeah. So it was kind of a joke at first. And then after I had been off trail for maybe 2-3 weeks, I said, you know what? I have nothing else to do. I'll head over to Scotland. And then I spent the next 3 months there.
Wow, nice. You know what? The irony of ironies, I'm supposed to be hiking in Scotland right now,
Oh, what were you supposed to be hiking in Scotland?
the West Highland Way.
Oh, okay.
I was going to do that, and then in a few days' time, we were going to do the what's it called now? The Hadrian's Wall Path. But I can do it again. It'll still be there next year, and I know that you recently had an article about the importance of managing your mental health during this current crisis. I know you're working, aren't you?
Mhm.
Have you faced challenges in that direction? How would you have been coping with it had you had to be at home?
Well, I think one of the biggest things for me after the marathon bombing, I was very embarrassed and I was almost ashamed because I was having this anxiety and was depressed after the marathon bombing because
Mm,
people had gone through so much worse.
yeah,
And, we live in such a comparative society that I thought that, I didn't have any right to feel this way when people had lost family members, they had lost limbs. I'd gotten off quite good. And what I realized is that the worst thing that happens in your life, that is the worst thing for you. And you can't compare that to anyone else.
sure.
And you shouldn't devalue your own feelings and emotions because of that. And I think the concern is that when we look at COVID, which is it's something that it's quite peculiar because it affects the entire world and it affects it in big and small ways. And people who are at home, who aren't working, they might feel that, it's totally normal to be anxious and to become depressed because of this, because it's disrupting your entire life.
Yeah,
But I'm afraid that people might look at it and say, oh, well, there's people working in healthcare right now that are facing COVID every day and they have it much worse and they're facing all this trauma. But you need to keep in mind your own mental health, and it's okay to be anxious and depressed about COVID. It's a totally normal reaction, and you shouldn't look to others thinking that they have it worse. The worst thing for you is the worst thing, and you
yeah,
need to handle that in an appropriate way.
yeah. Your perception is your reality, isn't it? You perceive something
Yeah.
to be something. That's what it is.
Everything's relative.
You intend to carry on hiking now, don't you? So where were you supposed to be right this very minute?
I'm supposed to be on the Pacific Crest Trail right now.
Oh, I bet you're gutted about that, aren't you? So
Uh,
will you go
yeah.
again next year? Will you go next year?
I'm starting grad school, so 2024 is that's been my girlfriend and I were gonna hike the Pacific Crest Trail together. So,
That'd be
and she's a physician, so she'll have to go back to work
that'd be
now. So we'll do the big thing for us right now is PCT 2024.
lovely. Well, look, Bubby, I'm so glad you came on. You wrote to me and came on the show. I think you've got a fascinating story, and I'm going to put the links to your book and your blog in the show notes just so people can see them and read about you. You've had a story, and I'm glad you're feeling better now, and I'm so glad you shared your story with us. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks so much, Steve. Really appreciate it.
Take it easy. Bye.
Bye.
Wow, what a story, eh? You can tell he's a speaker. He's used the bad thing in his life to push him forward and speaks with a passion about it. is a good reminder that even in your darkest hours, you can turn things into a positive. What a terrible couple of hours that must have been, not knowing whether his family was dead or alive. Nightmare. I want to thank once again those of you who have stepped up and donated to the show. You've really helped me maintain the show and all the other Hiking Radio Network shows for that matter. So much so that I'm starting to think I'll be doing this into my 70s. Now that is a scary thought. Don't forget, the donate button is on the podcast page of mightyblueontheat.com. I thank you, as ever, for your support. Let's hear what Kate Stillwell had on her mind when she texted me the other day and said, "Can you speak?" Here's Kate. I told you all a few weeks ago that I was still a little bit up in the air about what I wanted to do with the middle section of my show, and I was kind of really winging it with different sort of items each week. But what I was really waiting on was a decision from my guest today. It's our woman of a certain age, Kate Stillwell. Hi, Kate. How are you?
I'm hanging in there, Steve.
You sound like you're hanging in there. You're sounding, we spoke obviously before this, but you sound like you're a little bit stressed. So you've actually made a decision about your hike. Tell us what you're going to do.
Oh, yeah. All right. So just summary, I was supposed to flip-flop Sobo, meaning starting in Harper's Ferry, go to Springer, and assuming I survive that, fly to Katahdin and come down to Harper's Ferry.
Right.
But then, and that was all supposed to start April 1st. And since the ATC shut everything down and COVID, blah, blah, I postponed my hike. And now, strange as it seems, it looks like I'm starting in Harper's Ferry, but going north because, first off, I don't even know how far anyone can go these days.
Yeah,
but the plan is to go north, finish at Katahdin, and then come back here for a day or two, and then fly to Springer and go Springer.
So you're no-bowing. You're doing a kind of a no-bow flip-flop.
I mean, and of course I have the AT guide, which is Sobo, so I'm just going to be reading everything backwards.
Well, just turn it upside down.
I just feel like my whole life is backwards and upside down, and it's really unnerving. It's very frustrating. I don't know if any hostels, the Iron, what was it called? The Iron Mansion?
The Iron Masters, no. Iron Masters Mansion.
Yeah. Well, it turns out the ATC decided to run it this year, so they're closed. And I was kind of hoping that they were. Anyway, all I know is I'm taking 7 days of food up front.
Right.
And which is not what I had ever envisioned. So my pack weight is up there. It doesn't matter what the base was when you start adding.
Sure.
So
tell us then. So firstly, why did you come to this decision? And because you still sound like you're not sure you really want to do it. And also, when are you actually going to start tomorrow or the day after?
Tomorrow.
You're actually starting tomorrow. Okay. So
yeah.
How did you come to this decision then?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, the South isn't open. Number two, being May 12th when I start, Katahdin, there's a timeline beyond which you can't hike Katahdin. So I would prefer to at least do the northern part.
Sure.
And I'm more familiar with the North. I grew up in New York. Right. And have friends in Maine. And Vermont. So going north now makes infinite sense since I'm 7-8 weeks behind schedule.
Yeah.
And also now I'm following, the weather's cooler right now in mid-May in Pennsylvania. And Vermont is always a colder state. So hitting Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine in late summer is, I think, pretty much the only way to go from there.
I also think that you're going to be going, I don't know, when I was at Harper's, I think I was about May last year, and I loved being in New Hampshire and Maine in the summer. And I know you don't get the fall colours when you get to Maine, but to have that beautiful weather up in the whites, I will never forget it as long as I live. So I hope you get that great weather as well. So you've already told us you're going to take 7 days of food. So what's your strategy? You're not going to stay in any shelters? I mean, resupply.
Nope.
What are you thinking of doing?
Well, I wound up getting a Z-Pack duplex, two-person tent with the
Nice.
flex frame.
Right.
So that trading in a single Big Agnes.
Yeah, I have one of those. Have you put it up yet?
Oh, I have indeed been
Isn't
in
it
it,
amazing?
slept in it.
Isn't it amazing to
Yeah.
put it up? Oh, I love the way it goes up with that frame.
And I love that it's a one-piece unit, that
Yeah.
it sort of, once you get the carbon frame up, attached to it, it just pops up.
That's right. That's great.
So, and it's a lot easier to put away, et cetera. So I'm super excited about that. So my goal is not to spend any time in shelters whatsoever,
Right.
but to tent on the grounds by the shelters,
Right.
but pretty much stay out of shelters. And the goal is to resupply wherever there is food source that's within 1 or 2 miles from the trail, because I don't know that I can count on hitchhiking.
I think you can absolutely guarantee you won't get hitchhiking. I mean, it's just not.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to personally. I don't think that's going to happen at all. So that's definitely going to be tough.
Yep.
But so taking the extra time of food, that probably helps. You might want to watch out for Facebook. So I'm sure people will. There must be information on Facebook who's open, who's doing things, because there are still hikers out there on the trail now.
Yeah.
Mm.
I have seen on the Facebook pages to which I am a member, people are starting to get out there.
Yeah.
And I mean, I live in Maryland, and the governor said camping is now okie dokie,
Right.
but the ATC in their infinite wisdom says, no, it isn't. I get that 3 million people visit the Appalachian Trail and they don't want 3 million people converging, but how many thru hikers are there out of those 3 million? 5,000, 6,000 thru hikers. So it's a shame that there isn't a way to somehow make it so that thru hikers can go. But no, the ATC has said that, they're not giving out tags. And if you hike, they won't give you a certificate. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, okay.
Well,
But yes, Daddy.
Yeah,
Yes, Daddy. Well, I'm not hiking for a certificate.
That's the way it goes, I guess. I mean, I know that I looked up on their site this morning. They did do an update on May the 1st about restating that the rule, not the rules, or their idea is that people should be postponing their hikes, but they're putting together a task force to work out how to reopen. What about? I mean, I'm sure that sort of gives you some pause, really, anyway, because they are the guardians of the trail, and I wonder about trail maintainers. I don't know what the trail's like at the moment, but I remember there being blowdowns even when there were trail maintainers out there. So, as there haven't been any trail maintainers out there for a couple of months, I wonder what state the trail's in. Do you know?
I don't, but I can tell you this. When Alexa and I started in Maine in 2017 and we did Katahdin in the 100-mile wilderness, that was June 8th, and the crews had not gotten to any of the blowdowns.
All right.
And they were massive, and they were everywhere. Entire groves were down.
Yeah.
And at times we lost the trail because we were going over, under, around, any which way to, which way the trail bent, what? So a tree is just so long, you can follow it around and back to its source, to the trail.
Are you feeling? Yeah. I know that, but there's also the stability of some of the track as well. The trail as well. And are you feeling at all nervous about this, or are you quite relaxed? This is a good decision to make right now.
With regard to trail maintenance, et cetera, that doesn't bother me.
Okay.
The whole idea is unsettling right now,
Right.
because either this is going to be a great experience or it's going to
Suck big
not
time.
turn out.
It's going to suck big time.
So, well, and I don't know. I mean, certainly this experience will be more like it was 30 years ago when fewer people were on the trail.
Yeah.
And the trail was a little bit more virgin feeling, and et cetera. So, and people didn't have trail magic back in the day,
Sure.
and they didn't have,
Sure.
you didn't go hitchhiking everywhere. And resupply is my biggest
Yes.
question mark, because, in the final analysis, you really don't need to stay. I mean, it's nice to do laundry in town and to recharge the battery, and your phone, but shelter is what we're carrying with us every day.
Yeah. Well, you know that there's such a wide range of opinion on this. Some people are totally anti anybody going out there, and some people think you absolutely should show your right spirit. So perhaps those who think you're showing the right spirit might want to support you on the trail. They might even come and bring you food. So you never know. People listening to the show, if anybody wants to help out, just let me know, and I'll let Kate know as well. But look, listen, you're going out. You're starting tomorrow, as you say. So we're going to try to talk on Wednesday morning after your first night back out on the trail. So all I can say to you then is good luck out there, and for God's sake, stay safe. And I'll speak to you on Wednesday, and we'll see how that's worked out so far. All right.
All righty. Sounds like a plan.
Cheers.
Woohoo!
Cheers.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
So she's headed out. I know that some of you won't agree with the decision, and to be honest, I'm a little conflicted myself. Yet it's her decision, and I'm sure she's aware of some of the consequences. We spoke again 2 days later, and she had a couple of miles under her belt. What she said surprised me. Okay, we're back on with Kate. Hi, Kate. How are you?
I am awesome. How are you?
I'm good. It's now 11:15 on Wednesday, May the 13th, so you are a day and a half into it. What time did you start yesterday?
About 10:30. We had gone to the ATC headquarters.
Right.
Got the old picture there since the sign is still there.
All right.
And then since the path is to over the bridge is closed, what we decided is to drive over the 340 bridge and park, and then head up to the Weverton cliff.
So do you have to cut out a bit of the trail? I didn't realize that. So you start where?
We started at the parking lot for the Weverton cliffs,
Right.
because there's no access to the AT from the road.
Right.
So it makes it easy next time, because it's a well-known, well-defined parking lot. So
Sure.
when I'm finishing, that's where I'll finish.
Right. So what was it like yesterday being on the trail? Were there many people out there at all?
Actually, yeah, Weverton is pretty popular. So people go from Crampton to Weverton and back, or the other way around.
You can walk out down onto the cliffs, can't you, as it were? You can walk out onto the rocks, which is pretty awesome sight, isn't it?
Yep, it is. It is. We hung out there for a while. Eric decided to walk me up, keep me company for that mile or two or whatever it was.
Right.
And so it was nice to just sit out on the rocks and then walk back to the trail. And then we parted ways, and I just kept going. So, yeah, it's...
You're on it. So what condition is the trail in then?
Awesome. It's great. And in fact, I think it's called Crampton Gap, there's a shelter that's closed and privy that's closed. Yeah, whatever that means, since they really can't close it. Yeah. But there's a beautiful section of tenting areas. Right. So I threw up my tent, and as I was finishing up, two guys came down, a dad and his son, +1 and Cyborg. Hey there, guys. And they built a fire, invited me down, and we had dinner together. It was really, it was great. It was perfect.
So you're out there. So how many miles did you actually do yesterday then?
Just under 8,
right,
which is about what I wanted to do. Yeah, because I was also from the parking area, because apparently the shelter has bad water. So from the parking area, you can fill up, which I did. So I was carrying 6 pounds of water up the 1,000-foot incline.
Oh dear. So yeah. How did your pack feel? Because you got all this extra weight, you said. How's your pack feeling right now?
It's heavy, but it also hits me in different places than my other pack did, right, or my training pack. So yeah, that and the extra weight on my feet isn't making my feet happy. But that it takes a week or two to get it all together, and yeah, so it's not unexpected.
And how was the tent last night? The Z-Packs. Do you enjoy being in that?
It was phenomenal. It was, the wind died down. It was quiet as could be. Right. It was virtually no breeze. It was 40 degrees this morning, right, waking up, which isn't bad at all. It was, the full moon was, or not full moon, but I could see the moon through the tent, which is a little weird how you can see through the tent.
Oh, yes. There's no question about it. You want to be careful about you want to be careful about getting dressed and undressed in that tent, because it can light up a little bit. But so be careful. Just be aware of that. But it's
no mooning people.
Exactly. They certainly don't do that because they will see. But it's quite funny.
Yeah.
It's quite funny actually. Did you use the flex things, or did you
I did.
stake it down?
No, I use the flex frame, and I love it. It's all good. Every day the pack's going to get a little lighter as I eat the food and and get it all together.
And what about today? It's now 11:20, or 11:15 when we started talking. So how far have you gone today?
Only 6.5 miles.
Well, that's good. That's still fine. Wow.
I'm planning on doing 12 today. I really don't want to hit big miles. We talked about this.
Yeah. 12 miles on day 2 is a lot, I think, personally. But then, I was doing 7 and 8 for about the first 2 weeks, and I was very happy that I did. So have you got a plan for what the next couple of weeks are going to look like?
I do. I obviously am carrying a lot of food, and there are some resupply where the AT goes right through town.
Right.
So that's basically what I plan on doing. And if hostels aren't available, well, then it's
laundry
200 feet from a water source.
Yes.
Yeah,
good for you. So have you seen many people this morning?
I saw 4 thru-hikers.
Oh, really? Wow.
And the gal and a gal, I guess 3. And then the 2 people that I spent the evening with yesterday had started in Amicaloa, in Springer. And then they got off.
Right.
He was injured. So this was his shakedown to go back on in June.
Right.
But it was really nice running into someone who, a dad and son who actually are, part of the hiking family.
Sure. So have there been many blowdowns so far, or any problems with any of that?
Not really, just a few.
Is the trail quite overgrown?
No, not at all.
Interesting.
Not at all. And right now it's dry, which is great because you can see where it's been super muddy.
Yeah.
And the blowdowns around here, these are the old trees in Maine. They are the firs and the conifers that come down. So not only do you have the trunk, but you have, a 20-foot width of branches that are tangled to get through. So up there, it's a different story than down here. Here, you just kind of hop over,
Yeah. Well,
it's not so bad. So far anyway.
I saw a photo on Facebook today of somebody showing grass having grown over the path because obviously people haven't been walking it down. It looked amazing. It really did look incredible. So you're going to see something out there that none of us really saw, when we were doing our hike last year with all these people coming through. So I'm glad you're enjoying it. And so far it started well. But you've got some rain coming up, I believe, haven't you?
I think tomorrow, but it might be more intermittent, but then maybe a couple of days out. So
okay.
Trying to get, everything sorted. And those are the nights that I plan on being closer to a shelter. So if I need to run in, I can do that.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well,
it's all good.
Yeah, I'm pleased it's all
good.
I'm pleased it's all good. Let me know when we talk next. Give me a bit of notice, and I'll hop on then. Okay. You
betcha. You just let me know when you'd like to do that.
Okay. Cheers, then, Kate. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
So there are more thru-hikers out there, and I wouldn't be surprised if many more join them in the next couple of weeks. The ATC will soon update their guidance, I'm sure, and I'll be interested in what they say. We'll hear again from Kate next week. Before we get on to Grandma Gatewood this week, I wanted to give you the questions for our 6-book giveaway, including last week's guest books from Sarah Jones-Decker and Bruce Matson, plus mine. Sarah sent me her signed copy of a shelter book, and it is terrific. I tell you, you're going to love it. It just brings the shelters back to you. It's amazing, really. Bruce is waiting on the printer to send his, which is why I'm extending this another week. These are the questions. Sarah's one, which is, what is the largest non-hut shelter on the AT? And there have been a couple of answers to that. But try your hardest. And if you get any of them wrong, I send you back an email telling you that you've got 1 or 2 wrong, and you can then have another go. So don't worry too much about it. The second one is, in which town do participants in the Curly Maple Pizza Challenge purchase the beer and pizza necessary to complete the challenge? And the third one, which was asked by me, but which actually was in honour of Sarah's book, was what shelter has the highest elevation on the trail? Send in the answers to steve@mightyblueontheat.com and you'll go into a draw and the winner will get all 6 books. Finally today, it's Grandma Gatewood, whose fame and the danger she is facing keeps ramping up state after state. I'll see you next week. Chapter 12. I'll Get There. August the 14th to the 15th, 1955. Her sons were strong swimmers, and when they'd finished working in the tobacco fields, they'd race off toward the Ohio River and plunge into the cold water, washing away the day's dust and sweat. It was a good distance to the opposite bank, but when they were up to the challenge, they could tear across the river and reach the other side as if they were born with gills. Their mother could not swim. She'd never learned how. If you dropped her into the Ohio, she could probably keep her head above water for a few moments out of sheer grit and determination, but she lacked the fundamentals of buoyancy. She never spoke to her family of the months she spent preparing to hike the Appalachian Trail, but they'd later learned from friends and acquaintances in southern Ohio that Emma was often seen in the woods in advance of a journey. Her children would learn that she secretly made overnight expeditions to the wilderness to determine what equipment was completely necessary, what foods were lightweight and would help her maintain energy, and what first aid supplies she might need in an emergency. Despite those hours spent in forethought, she had never picked up the skill that would have proved mildly comforting, at least on August the 14th, as the creeks and streams in the Green Mountains continued to rise. Emma set out at about 8 a.m. with the young men from Harlem and their leaders, and they waded through water to their knees for much of the trail that morning, coming eventually to a fast-moving creek that was 15 feet wide. They gradually stepped into the water, which came above Emma's knees. They slowly worked their way across, the leaders keeping a close eye on the young men. They used walking sticks to brace themselves against the swift current until they'd each made it to safety. A short time later they came to 10 Kilns Brook, which intersected the trail, and this stream was swollen as well, 20 feet from bank to bank. In the middle was a large rock, and the water between them and the rock wasn't flowing as rapidly as it was beyond the rock. The leaders went first, carefully manoeuvring to the other side. Then the boys started, walking first to the rock, then grabbing hold of a pole held by one of the leaders and inching the rest of the way across against the heavy flow. Emma was last. She baby-stepped through the calmer water to the rock, then heaved her pack across to one leader and gripped the pole for the rough stretch. When she stepped into the swift water, it nearly took her feet from under her. She held tight to the pole and kept moving, feeling the creek bottom with her feet, trying to keep her balance until she reached the other side. The rain stopped that morning. The sun burned down. Emma's soaked clothes began to dry, and gradually things seemed a little better. The group stopped at Old Job's shelter for lunch, and the boys laughed as they pelted green apples off a nearby tree. A few hours of hiking later, their clothes had dried completely, and they walked across a rustic wooden bridge to a shelter on a little island. It was a beautiful spot where the mirrored waters of a little rocky pond, stocked full with rainbow trout, reflected the mountains covered by evergreens. Emma thought about staying. She would have liked to, but she needed to make progress after a slow and miserable last couple of days. She said goodbye to the group from Harlem, picked up her pace and put in 7 more miles through farmland and a long patch of lowlands before bedding down for the night at Bufham's shelter. She logged the experience in her diary, adding, "The boys, all but one coloured, were very nice." There is no other mention of them in her journals, and one might easily assume from the paragraphs dedicated to the chance encounter that the boys were simply Roman Catholic youths on a wilderness journey. Their story was lost for decades, but before his death in 2010, one of the white leaders would recount meeting Emma Gatewood on the trail. Reverend Dr. David Loomis wrote this version of those few wet days. The summer I turned 21, I worked for a church in East Harlem, New York, which had the highest density of population on earth at that time and a murder rate to prove it. Each square inch of concrete was fought over by gangs, with summer's heat adding fuel to that fire. In the hopes of brokering peace between the 2 largest rival gangs, the church I worked for had me take the 4 top honchos of each gang for a week-long hike along the Appalachian Trail in Vermont. None of the 8 could resist the church's invitation to take an all-expenses-paid vacation far from the heat of the city. Our first day out, we hiked 15 miles out before a hurricane unexpectedly blew inland and trapped us inside an 8 by 20 foot trailside lean-to. As night fell, Emma Gatewood, a 5'2" grandma who was living her dream of hiking the entire trail from Georgia to Maine staggered into camp. Bruised, exhausted, her gear and provisions washed away by swollen streams, she was in dire need. What made things tricky was that Emma was a genteel white southern lady. She could hide neither her drawl nor her unease at living in close proximity to 8 young black males, her distress leading all 8 to bestow on her their stoniest stares. It rained and blew hard. The brute force of nature so overwhelmed us it literally dissolved the tension in our lean-to. That hurricane, by facing us with a severe, totally mutual challenge, forced us all back to what we had in common, our humanity. Like people trapped in a lifeboat, we came together to try to stay afloat. We took turns standing by a fire we had built by breaking off dead branches, thereby freeing up enough floor space for 5 of us to stretch out and sleep. We also took turns getting drenched collecting more deadwood. Hiking out once the rains let up, Emma piggybacked on a variety of youthful backs as we forded swollen torrents that would have swept her downstream had she attempted them on her own. Whoever she was piggybacking on had somehow to stay balanced midstream while enduring a tight, often suffocating neck squeeze from her 2 thin, bony arms. Mary Snow's story about Emma ran in Sports Illustrated on August the 15th, the day Emma would face death, under a black and white photograph of her on the trail. The headline was, "Pat on the Back." A 67-year-old great-grandmother, Mrs. Emma Gatewood of Gallipolis, Ohio, is determined to be the first woman to hike the entire length of the Appalachian Trail, 2,050 miles of mountain footpath from Mount Oglethorpe, Georgia, to Mount Katahdin, Maine. Mrs. Gatewood, alone and without a map, began following the white blaze marks of the trail early in May, and this week from Connecticut's Cathedral Pines, Grandmother Gatewood could look back on 1,500 miles of the best and worst of nature. She had carefully avoided disturbing 3 copperheads and 2 rattlesnakes on the trail, flipped aside 1 attacking rattler with a walking stick. When caught without nearby shelter, she had heated some stones and slept on them to keep from freezing. For snacks, Grandma nibbled wild huckleberries, young sorrel for salad, and sucked bouillon cubes to combat loss of body salt. Her contacts with other humans ranged from a miserly individual who had refused her even a drink to a generous housewife who supplied fried chicken to carry on the trail. Mrs. Gatewood is serenely confident that she can finish her trick. "I'll get there except if I break something loose. And when I get atop Mount Katahdin, I'll sing America the Beautiful, from sea to shining sea." She could go no farther. She had started at 6 a.m. and faced a wicked, weedy trail all morning before coming to Clarendon Gorge. This one was wider than the others, 40 feet from bank to bank, wide enough to necessitate a bridge even when the creek wasn't flooded. The old bridge had burned some time ago and a temporary bridge had been fashioned, but rains from the storm had washed the new bridge out. There was no way she could cross. She walked up the gorge a ways and found a spot that she estimated was only about 3 feet deep, but the water was moving so swiftly that she wasn't about to try it alone. She hollered into the woods to see if anybody was within earshot. Maybe there was a chance someone nearby knew where she could get across. She got no response. She was all alone and she was stuck. She removed the damp clothes from a sack and laid them out in the sun to dry. If she was going to be forced to wait, at least she could be productive and lighten her load a bit. She spread out a blanket too and decided to catch a little sun. After days of grey, cloud-covered skies, the warm light was welcome. And she waited. Nobody came by noon, or by 1 o'clock, or by 2, or by 3. Long hours she spent idle. Then around 4 o'clock she heard someone coming. She stood and peered down the trail and saw who it was. Howard Bell and Steve Sargent, the 2 boys she had met several days before, the Navy boys. She couldn't have planned it better. She was surprised and very happy to see those 2. They'd had a rough go. What started as a nice little outdoor break from the Navy had turned into a wet and soppy journey. It had rained 8 out of 9 days they'd been on the trail, so much that their feet were blistered and they were miserable. Emma told them about her predicament and walked them down to the gorge that was now so wide and flowing so fast. The young men inspected the water and decided they could wade across if they took some precautions. They walked back to where they had dropped their backpacks. One of the boys fished a big bunch of parachute cord from his. He tied Emma's sack securely to the top of his big, heavy backpack, then tied a length of cord around his waist. The other young man tied a cord around his own waist and they walked down to the water's edge. Emma stood between them and they looped the cord around her waist, tying her firmly in the middle, a human sandwich. When the knots were tight, the boys each took one of her hands and they began to slowly wade against the roaring current. The water inched past their knees, then their waists, then up to their chests, beating hard against their bodies. They strained against the current. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the stone riverbed with her feet, trying for all she was worth to hold on, step by slippery, precarious step. Her head was swimming. She opened her eyes but couldn't look at the current that was trying to suck her downstream. She tilted her chin back and stared up at the sky instead and squeezed the boy's hands. One of the young men, Sergeant, would say 57 years later that he was so scared crossing that river that he still visited it in his dreams at the age of 79. We were touch and go getting across, he would say. The other, Bell, would recall how fast the water was flowing and how he felt that one misstep would send them all rushing downstream, tangled in rope. They'd both come back decades later to hike the same ground, and they'd fondly remember Emma's friendly, determined nature. She was one tough old bird, Bell would say. That day, though, there in the middle of the rushing water, so close to catastrophe, Emma Gatewood laughed out loud at how ridiculous it was that a 67-year-old woman had gotten herself into such a predicament. They finally reached dry ground and scrambled up the bank. She ducked into woods to change from her wet Bermuda shorts and back into her dungarees. "Well," she said, reappearing, "you got Grandma across."